Thanks, Megan. And thanks you all for joining us today as we talk about budget revisions, amendments, and program income. So here are the usual slides that you see every session. So Megan will keep you muted, but we do want to hear your questions and comments. So please use the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will be sending everyone who's on our contact list the recording of today's session, the PDF of the PowerPoint, and a summary of some of the key points. You'll receive that from cja.r3training@illinois.gov. And if you'd like to add any more of your staff to the contact list to receive invitations to the last several trainings that we'll be conducting in this initial series, and to receive the follow-up emails, please use that cja.r3training@illinois.gov email address to provide us the staff member name, their role in the grant, and their email. So we have a pretty full agenda again today. We're going to talk about program income. We're going to talk about the difference between a budget revision and an amendment. We'll talk about the process to request a budget revision, what we do when we receive a budget revision request, how we review and approve it. And then finally, we're going to talk just a little bit about subaward budget revisions. So let's talk about program income. You know, in the original training series that we sent out, we were just going to do this session on budget revisions and amendments. And we like to provide that information kind of early on in the grant process, so you understand how those things happen, and we're kind of giving you a warning to make sure that you don't just go ahead and change your budget or try to amend your agreement without understanding that process. But we've also had a couple of grants that we've seen that probably have program income. Now, program income, now this is what 2 CFR 200 describes it as, the gross income earned by a non-federal entity, which just means our grantee, that's directly generated by a supported activity. So this is a screenshot of the language as it refers to program income in your grant agreement, which some of you haven't received yet, but this is how it appears in the grant agreement. You'll see that it starts by saying asset seizures and forfeitures that are generated by the program. And in the almost 1,000 grants that the authority administers, principally the grants that have program income are these network of drug units and drug prosecution programs where they are seizing assets from the offenders, and they are awarded to those units as a direct result of their work with drug offenders. That's principally where we're seeing it, but because R3 is such an unusual program where instead of having a model that we sort of like ask our community agencies to implement, where we have more of like a bottom-up model with R3, where we want you to tell us what program will solve the issue that you have in your community. And so we've seen a couple of grants that look like they have program income. So we're adding that information to this training now so that you have that early on in the program, because if you do have program income, you will need to be accounting for it throughout the life of the grant. So basically, program income is any income that's received by the grantee agency as a result of the funded program. So that includes any fees that are paid by the participant, any participant co-pays, or fees that are paid on behalf of participants, as well as any registration fees that are paid for program events that you put on as part of the program. Program income is not your grant funding from the authority or discounts on purchases that you receive because you're a nonprofit, any other grants or donations that you receive, as well as income that's derived from programming that's not funded by the authority. So if you're operating 5 programs and some of those other programs that are not funded by the authority are receiving program income as a direct result of those activities, but your authority program is not generating that income, then we don't care about that other income. We only care about income that's generated as a direct result of the authority grant. So here are the most common examples of program income. If you're hosting a conference and you're selling tickets to that conference, then that would be considered, that's part of the funded program. Then those ticket sales are considered program income. If you're saving your grant funds in an interest-bearing account, that interest would be program income. If you're providing legal services and the court awards attorney fees, then that would be program income. If you're running a summer camp where youth make widgets, and then the agency sells those widgets, that's program income. And as I said earlier, any participation fees that your participants are paying, or if another entity is paying those fees on behalf of your participants, that's all considered program income. So what we do once we identify that this income qualifies as program income, because the program income is derived from grant funds, then a portion of that program income must be spent on the program before the end of your grant period of performance. And the program income can be only used for the same purposes as the program. And they're all subject to the same cost allowability standards as your grant funds are, and has to be spent within that same period of performance as the grant. If the program income isn't spent within the period of performance of your grant, then the balance of the program income has to be returned to the authority as part of the closeout process. As I said, the program income must meet the program allowability guidelines. So if an expense isn't allowable to be used by your grant funds, then you can't use your program income for those expenses either, right? So for instance, let me give you an example. Fundraising is not an allowable expense. So if your program generates program income, we will not allow you to use that program income for fundraising because that's not an allowable expense. Also, you're going to need to spend the program income on the program in the same proportion that the grant funds support the program. That sounds like double talk. What I mean is that when the grant supports 100% of the program that's generating the income, then 100% of the program income must be spent on that same program. So it's that proportion, like when the example that I used that we typically see are these drug units that, drug enforcement units that generate program income from seizures and forfeitures of assets from the of drug offenders. Those units are usually fairly large, and we are supporting only a small piece of that overall unit. So if we're supporting 20% of the manpower of that drug enforcement unit, and that unit, gets $100 in program income, then $20 needs to be spent on the program. So that's what I mean about the proportion. So we'll be looking at that. So be mindful of this as you are beginning your program. If your grant specialist identifies any income that's generated by your program as program income, they'll also provide you more detailed guidance on how you will need to account for that program income and how you'll account for the spending of that program income on the grant program. So there's an example. We'll stop here for some questions, Megan. Any questions so far?
Nope, no questions.
Great. As I said, program income will likely affect a couple of our programs this year. I don't anticipate that it will generally affect our programs, but we wanted you to have that information up front. So now we also want to tell you about the difference between budget revisions and amendments. Now, a budget revision just reallocates the current grant dollars in your agreement. And a budget revision doesn't change any term of the grant agreement or the sub-grant agreement for that matter as well. Budget revisions always require your grant specialists okay, as well as our fiscal offices okay. And if you're adding new line items through this budget revision, we may also require our legal offices okay of this budget revision. The budget revision does require the signature of your authorized signers. So the same folks that signed the original budget, in the grant agreement that you're negotiating right now, those folks will also have to sign the budget revision in the new budget when you revise the budget. By contrast, an amendment that is used when we are revising one or more terms of the grant agreement. The most common examples of when we will issue an amendment is if we are extending the period of performance, or if we're going to add on your year 2 funding to your current agreement. We would be amending not only the period of performance to give you another year's worth of program activity, but we'll be giving you additional dollars to support that second year of activity. So that's an amendment. It changes one of the terms of your grant agreement. The amendment will always require the same approvals that our original grant agreements do. So that means that we need both our legal and fiscal offices okay. It's going to require the signature of the grantee staff that signed the original agreement. So the way that you're receiving your initial grant agreement now through DocuSign, and you're going to have electronic signatures from the authorized folks at your agency, then an amendment would go through that exact same process, and you'll receive the amendment document through the DocuSign system, and your authorized signers, your executive director, your CFO, those folks would also have to sign the amendment. And then it comes back to the authority where our executive director will sign the amendment. So they're very different things. They're used for different purposes. Yes, Megan?
There's been a real quick request. Can you go back one slide for just a second?
Sure. Was there a question on that, or they just want to see the slide?
They just asked if they could see the slide for a second.
Okay. So this is on the budget revision. So this is a budget revision doesn't increase the size of your grant, right? It's just reallocating the funds that are budgeted. So our 3 grantees now are just going through the execution phase of their grant agreements. So you're finalizing your initial budget. So we don't want to be seeing a budget revision tomorrow. A budget revision probably won't even become a possibility for several months. But we'll go through the whole budget revision process, but we wanted you to see just how the budget revision just reallocates existing funding, where an amendment is going to change a term of the grant agreement. So the most common reasons for a budget revision is if you have delays in hiring, or if there's a delay in executing any subawards or other contracts under your agreement. If you find out that a line item is no longer needed. I'll also add that, if your estimate at the beginning of a grant, if you've kind of overestimated what something might cost, and you find out that you didn't have to expend that whole line item to get the 5 laptops that you need for your new staff, then you have some, what we term as lapsing funds. They're funds that will not be expended, and so they're available for reallocation. So as I said, a budget revision just reallocates funds to other line items. So in that example, if you have $400 left after you purchase those 5 laptops because you overestimated that cost, you may reallocate that $400. if you underestimate it and they actually cost more, then you're going to have to find the shortage someplace else in your budget, right? So if you have that extra $400, then you may say, well, now I have more money available for that local travel that I need. You're going to, change the quantity of something that's an existing line item, or add another line item that you have identified as necessary for the program. I will also, I don't know if it's on the next slide or not, but whatever revisions that you make, the revisions must support activities that were in the general scope of that original application. But a budget revision is minimally required when you add a new line item. You can't just add a new line item to the grant without going through the budget revision process. And if there's a change of $1,000 or 10% or more in any line item, then you will need to do a budget revision. As I said, the budget revisions reallocate the funds that are already in your agreement. They don't increase the funds that are available. Any increase in the funds would have to be done through an amendment, but we've already spent all of the R3 money for this cohort, so there aren't dollars that are available to add to your agreement. So when you're doing a budget revision and suggesting the reallocation of funds, remember that all of those changes, all those revisions to the budget must be both reasonable and necessary. Remember when we did the session on cost allowability, reasonable and necessary is like the foundation of that. So that revised budget that you're suggesting cannot support expenditures and activities beyond that original scope of the agreement. So if you have a significant amount of funds that are lapsing and you're like, I've always wanted to do this other component of the program, we're going to say no to that, because this was a very competitive process, right? There's like almost 600 applications that we received for this funding, and we only had enough money available to fund 88 programs. So we can't, after we've made that selection process, we can't be kind of going beyond the scope of that original application. So bear that in mind if you do have lapsing funds, that we can't like move outside the scope of that original proposal that you sent in. So a couple of other things to remember if you are doing budget revisions, if they become necessary throughout the life of the grant, that the rules on conflicts of interest still apply. So any procurements, any hiring, any contracting, any leasing, they all have to be competitive. So that would trigger the conflict of interest red flag for us. You also have to keep the salaries reasonable. So if you have lapsing dollars, you can't just pay the staff more money, and they have to be reasonable. And if you do have lapsing funds, there's actually no requirement that you reallocate those funds to fully budget them. There's no requirement to fully budget all of the designated dollars. So we don't want you to say, well, I've got money to spend. What can I do to spend it? The question should be, what funds do I need to really fully implement this program? Any questions there, Megan?
Nope, no questions.
Great. So how do you request a budget revision? We are not going to provide you the budget revision request forms. That's because we want you to first discuss the need for a budget revision with your grant specialist. So we want you to call them or email them and discuss the need for the revision and the timing of the budget revision. Because one rule that we are very clear on is that budget revisions must be requested no later than 60 days before the end date of the agreement. We find that requests that we get after that date are really just spending to spend, and they're typically not reasonable and necessary budget revisions. So that's something that we discuss when we come out and do our site visit with you. We look at how your spending is progressing and, see if there is the need for a budget revision. If you have run into one of those situations that I said where there's like significant delays in hiring staff, issuing your subawards or issuing subcontracts, and so you know that you're going to have a significant lapse, that's something to discuss with your grant specialist. If they find that budget revision that you're requesting is reasonable and necessary, then they'll send you the paperwork. And that paperwork is a budget revision request form, as well as a marked up budget. And what I mean by marked up budget is I want you to take your existing budget and to make the changes that you would like to see. So if that contract was originally budgeted for 12 months and you didn't get the contract issued until the third month of the grant, now you have 2 months worth of contract costs that are going to lapse. I want you to change that line item to 10 months instead of 12. That will show me that the money won't be used until the third month of the grant. And then show me, create that new line item or adjust those existing line items to show me how you'd like to spend those lapsing funds. But we also want you to send us a new, clean, revised budget that reflects what the budget would look like after these changes are made. So those are the 3 pieces that your grant specialist will expect to receive after you've had this conversation. They've provided you the form, they've kind of reviewed the process, and then we'll receive that budget revision request. One other piece, if you are receiving advance pay or working capital advance, we also want you to submit your PFR with an updated cash budget. So we want you to go in, and where you originally had a cash budget that plotted out your monthly expenses for the whole 12 months, and and on that line item for that contract that didn't get started on time, you're going to take it out of months 1 and 2, and you're going to show us where you're going to be, if this budget revision is approved, where you're going to be spending that money throughout the balance of the grant. So you'll be updating your cash budget as well. One common error is after you send in your budget revision request and this marked up budget, where grantees forget to update the budget narrative. Because remember, the budget narrative is really important to us because that's where you're demonstrating that line item is both reasonable and necessary, and how you develop that cost estimate. So in my example of the late contract, you're going to write on the budget narrative that the contract wasn't initiated until month 3, and that's going to result in a lapse of X dollars. And then you're going to, update any other line items that are changing as a result of this budget revision request. We're going to ask you to to email all of these documents to your grant specialist, and then also kind of reiterate the need for the budget revision in that email. So that's another way of documenting why you're requesting this change. There's an example. And I also want to caution you that budget revisions are not in effect until you receive a letter from your grant specialist that approves the budget revision and provides you an adjusted budget. So just the fact that you've requested a budget revision doesn't mean that you have authority to make that change, to incur those costs that you're requesting in the budget revision. So when we receive your budget revision, we're going to work as quickly as possible because we want to turn this back to you so you can make those changes. And you'll also get a letter from your grant specialist if that budget revision is not approved. So don't do anything after you've submitted the budget revision until you receive a letter from your grant specialist, because the expenditure of funds under a requested revision is prohibited and will not be reimbursed until you get that letter, right? So if there's no written approval provided, then that reimbursement won't be allowed. So even if you have a darn good reason for this budget revision and a really good use of the funds, don't go ahead and incur those costs until you get the letter, because they will be disallowed, even if it's a really good reason. I was thinking of a good example of last night, of like a civil legal services program that's supposed to help folks that are at risk of eviction. And so we've been providing this program for a little while. You have identified funds, but also identified that some of your clients are having problems, like really engaging with you, and that's harming their case, right? That's putting them at even greater risk of being evicted. But you sense that some of the trauma that your clients may have experienced in their life that's leading them to this point of possibly being evicted, and then the potential for being evicted is adding to this trauma, and you've identified a really good training that will help your attorneys better engage with folks that have experienced trauma. That sounds like a great reason for a budget revision, right? It's within the scope of the original agreement of providing civil legal services to clients who are at risk of eviction. It's enhancing the skills of your staff. That's a great reason. But if you go ahead and you register for that great training that will help you better implement your program and better help you serve your clients, if you go ahead and register for that training before you get that letter, then we won't be able to pay you for that training. So really pay attention to when you get that letter, and that's when you can go ahead and incur those costs. You can revise the budget. Any questions so far, Megan?
No question.
Okay. So what do we do when we get that budget revision materials from you? So the first step is always the grant specialist. When they're satisfied with that this budget revision is okay, they're going to send it over to their program manager for their review and approval. And after the manager is satisfied, they're going to send it over to fiscal for their review and approval. And as I said, if there are any questions about allowability, or if you're adding new line items, we may also send it over to our legal staff for their review and approval. And the same way that you're experiencing this now is you're executing your initial agreement, and you're probably getting comments and questions from your grant specialist now to clarify and strengthen your grant materials. For a budget revision request, the same thing will be true, that you can expect questions or requests from a revision from your grant specialist and all of those other folks at the authority that are required to review and approve these materials. So you may get multiple sets of questions. Hopefully your grant specialist will do a good job right at the beginning and will identify most of those issues up front, so it will move through the rest of the review process. But there's always other things that come up along the way. That's why we have the different departments with their different specializations review these materials. So what do we? Yes, ma'am.
Someone says, will it need to be an official letter, or will an email from the specialist be good enough if we're working with a deadline?
No, the grants, we have provided our grant specialists with like template letters. So the grant specialist will email you a letter that will tell you that the approval, that your budget revision has been approved. And it's on a later slide, but I'll tell you right now that that letter will indicate the effective date of the budget revision. So they'll tell you when that will document when you can go ahead and make those changes and incur those costs.
Thank you. That was the only question that came through.
Okay, thanks, ma'am. So these are the questions that we ask. And I think you may have seen when we talked about doing our original review of the agreements, these are the things that we look at when we review your budget revision request, and these are the things we looked at in your budget when we first negotiated your agreement. Are those costs reasonable, and are they necessary? We're also going to be asking if the need for the revision is clear, and does it sufficiently justify the change? Does the math add up? And also, as I said before, do the changes, are they necessary for the program, and are they within that original scope of the agreement? Any other questions pop up, Meg?
Nope, no questions.
Okay. After we've received all of those review and approvals from the authority, your grant specialist will mail you this letter that will be approving or possibly disapproving the budget revision. And they'll also, if it is approved, they will send you a copy of the approved budget. They'll also update your PFR to reflect the new approved budget. And as I said earlier, the effective date of the budget revision will be specified in that letter that your grant specialist will email to you. I think I'm just going to dive right into the subaward budget revision process, but I'm sure that you're wondering how long this process takes. It will, we have to walk through all those levels of approval. And as I said, we try to do it as quickly as possible, especially if there is something that is, time sensitive, like you really want to get your staff approved to go to that conference on trauma-informed civil legal care. If there's a big deadline, we'll try to meet that deadline as best we can, but we do have to walk through all those steps. And the better job that we do at the beginning of really making sure that those costs are allowable and that the reasons for the budget revision are really clear, the better the initial package that we have, the faster it's going to go through all these levels of approval. And we'll get you that letter more quickly. So we've been talking a little bit on our Wednesday sessions about subawards, and not every grant has a subaward, but we do want you to be aware of the subaward budget revision process. So subaward budget revisions are not approved by the authority, they're approved by the grantee. So remember, subawards are actually, they're a contract between the grantee and their subaward partners. Now, we provide you all the templates, and you will be submitting those draft subawards to us for our review and approval, but they really are a contract between the grantee and the subaward partner. So any revisions to those budgets are really the responsibility of the grantee to approve, not the authority. Now, we can provide you our forms that we use for the budget revision, but you're not required to use them. But you should be developing, if you have subawards, a subaward budget revision process that minimally follows the same process that we have. So you're going to require a written request, an explanation of the need for the changes that should be coming from your subaward partner. They should also be providing you a revised budget that demonstrates the changes that they're requesting. And you should be providing your subaward partner written approval or disapproval of the budget revision request. You're going to ask the same questions that we ask when we review your budget revision requests. Are the changes necessary and reasonable and allowable? Are they necessary? Are the reasons clear and sufficient to justify the change? And of course, does the math add up correctly? Now, even though we don't approve budget revisions, we do recommend that if that first budget revision that you do for a subaward partner, that you send that to your grant specialist for their review, just to kind of make sure that it's that you get a second set of eyes on it, and they're going to make sure particularly that the request is allowable and sufficiently documented. But in the end, the approval of the budget revision is the responsibility of the grantee. So that's all the information that I have on you. I have for you rather. So here are our next trainings. We're coming to the end of this initial series. So next Wednesday, we're going to go into detail on subaward site visits. That's Wednesday, November 6th. And then we're finally going to get to the PPR. So our research and analysis staff are going to introduce you to the PPR, the Periodic Performance Report, on Thursday, November 7th. And then we'll have a final session in this series on Wednesday, November 13th, where we're going to discuss best practices in PPR, in the performance reporting. I'll send you this afternoon, I'll send you the link to the training survey. We appreciate it when you use the link and give us feedback on how we're doing. And now we're just left to questions. What questions have come up, Megan?
No new questions.
That's great. All right, thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your time and we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.